Right, hello again. Time for Dram 209, and this is another Canadian. We are still in the middle of our Canadian run, and this is not necessarily the best known Canadian whisky, because arguably worldwide Canadian Club is probably better known worldwide, but this particular one, which is, I've got quite a few bottles down there and I'll explain why in a second, is this one, which is Crown Royal, is the #1 Canadian whisky sold in America. So in America, Crown Royal probably the biggest, but I think worldwide, certainly in the UK, Canadian Club is arguably more well known than Crown Royal. And I think it's mainly because Crown Royal sells so much in America that not that much of it gets shipped to the UK. In the UK, you're looking at about 28 quid a bottle the Whisky Exchange were selling it for. This is what the full-size bottle looks like. So Crown Royal was actually created in 1939 by a guy called Samuel Bronfman, who was the president of Seagram's Drinks Company. That was a pretty big drinks company of its day. It was probably on a par with Diageo at the time. Now, speaking of Diageo, they actually own the brand now because Seagram got split up in around the 2000s. I think it was probably even 2000, and Diageo took a lot of their brands over. So Crown Royal is now owned by the behemoth that is Diageo. So 1939, Crown Royal was created because that year King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited Canada, and this was basically in tribute to them. So they come across, Samuel's there going, President of Seagram's, right, we need a special whisky for them. And until 1964, you could only get Crown Royal in Canada, nowhere else. After that point, it started to spread along around the rest of the world. Now, it was made originally in 2 of their distilleries. They had a distillery in Waterloo, Ontario, which is here, and that closed down in 1992, and it is now solely produced in a distillery. It's called the Crown Royal Distillery, and it's a Gimli, which I'm sure is the dwarf in Lord of the Rings, which is in on the shores of Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. So apparently this is a blend of 50 whiskies, but it's a blended whisky. So it's a combination of corn and rye and barley, and they make it in this distillery. So saying it's a combination of 50 whiskies is essentially different batches that they are making. I think that's what they're doing. They're basically saying, oh, we're blending 50 whiskies together, but it's the different batches that they're making. So it's different ages, and it's going to be different sort of runoffs that they've got, and they're making it, they're aging it, and they're going, right, we'll use that. It's possible that it's even 50 different casks that they're blending together in big batches. It could be that sort of thing. I think it's more of a marketing term rather than anything specifically special. That's my feeling anyway. So Crown Royal, I have this, which is the sample that I was going to use. Now, this was actually part of a load of miniatures that I was given by the parents of one of my daughter's school friends, and she said, look, my aunt's died. They used to travel the world. They've got loads of miniatures. They've got loads of bottles of whiskey. I don't know what to do with it. We don't drink the stuff. Can you try and sell some? And I did. I've sold a couple of them for a few £100, and I've just given them the cash and said, look, I can't sell the rest of them. I've tried on Facebook. Auction houses will take a percentage, but I've got them in boxes. They're in my garage. They're not in the way. I don't mind holding on to them and trying to sell them. And they said, look, just have them, just do it. And I've used quite a few of them for the challenge. They actually had about 30 that I've been able to use to start me off in this challenge while everybody else has been donating stuff. So this one, which is a plasticky, was the Crown Royal that I was going to use. However, if you look at this is still sealed, but if you look, the fill level is not brilliant, and I do wonder how old this particular one is. So I actually was sent a sample donated by Michael Bradley, who sent me this from New York. So this is the sample I'm going to use, because I know this is more recent, and I know there's no danger of this being potentially affected by I've had a couple of, as if you've watched my Glenturret review, you'll know that the fill level was even worse, but that was almost undrinkable, and I think it was because of the evaporation. So this is what I'm going to use. However, I also have 2 other miniatures which are in this selection. These 2, and these are, might be able to hear, actual glass, you'll notice that there is some bits on the top here. These are customs labels, and they actually have the year on them. So let me show you that one first. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to pick it up, but you'll see on there it says, perhaps is that upside down? No, it's not upside down. 1976. And this one, 1975. A dated miniatures of Crown Royal. Now, this is the 75. You'll see that the fill level on that is absolutely fantastic, whereas this particular one, the 76, not so great at all. I'd love to know how valuable that is. I really would. It's a case of finding. I've tried to put these on some Facebook groups of people sending miniatures and things like that, and nobody's really interested. But very, very interesting to have this. And what's also interesting is I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see the top, the actual top of this, because it's just a screw cap. It's plastic, but it's in the shape of a crown. Whereas this more recent one, which is the plastic one, is just a bog standard. So obviously they've been scaling back, but this is not long after they started exporting it to the rest of the world. So let's crack on with this. Now, I also have another one. There's going to be like an extra bonus one at the end of this, simply because I was given a little sample by somebody else, which I'll go into. And I think it's only right for me to do it at this time. It doesn't count towards the challenge. I'm not going to count it as Dram 210, and I'm not going to be doing a full dram of it because it doesn't count towards the challenge. But I will be very intrigued. I've just spilt some on the counter. Give me a second. I'm going to get some paper because I don't particularly want my kids sticking their fingers in a load of whiskey when they're having breakfast tomorrow morning. Plus it's going to smell in the kitchen. Nice smell for me, but I don't think my wife's that chuffed with it. So, Crown Royal, massive seller in the UK, 40% ABV. Like I say, 28 quid, the Whisky Exchange was selling it for, but you tend to find this for about $20 in the US. Now, there's a definite rye element kicking through there. I don't know what the constituent parts are in terms of the corn to the rye to the barley, but rye is definitely kicking through here. There's a nice edginess to it. There's a really soft spice feel. And a good toffiness to it as well. That's actually quite a pleasant nose. It's not particularly deep or complex, but what is there is slightly fresh and slightly grainy and slightly juicy as well. You know what? That's actually all right. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting a great deal out of this at all. But, especially having had Canadian Club, Canadian Mist was not great, but Canadian Club, I've associated this and Canadian Club to be very, very similar. And to be honest, this has got a lot more depth to it. I don't even know what the aging is. It's a non-age statement, so I don't really know what the sort of average age of this is. But it's got a lot more depth than Canadian Club. Head and shoulders above Canadian Mist as well. Although Canadian Mist is like half the price, but there's actually quite a nice fruity mouthfeel, and it really is quite fruity. There's a real banoffee pie feel to it. A very smooth banana toffee, even the biscuit crumb, possibly even a banoffee pie that's got meringue on the top of it. But there's also some juiciness of like a juicy berry, not quite strawberry and not as sharp as raspberry, but more like a black currant and blackberry feel to it as well. It's actually not too dissimilar to Irish whiskey. If you like Irish whiskey, that's not far off, to be perfectly honest. It might be a bit too smooth for some. There's not really a great deal on the finish. It dies off pretty quickly. The mouthfeel starts off really rich and smooth and then tails off quite quickly, even before you swallow. The finish, there's not really much to it. But as a everyday drinker, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I can see why it's become really popular. And I can see why it's done really, really well, because there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing massively outstanding about it, but what it does very, very well. It's got a nice mouthfeel. It's got enough complexity to make it interesting. The flavours that are there are enjoyable. There's no harshness, there's no burn, there's not a great deal of massive depth of flavours, but what are there are clean and well balanced and work really well together. You know, it's very banoffee-ish. The nose has slightly more rye element than the palate does. The palate is much more fruity than I was expecting. But all in all, that is actually a lot better than I thought it was going to be. Now, what I've forgotten to do is get some water and another glass, because this is the time for me to do my little bonus review. Because when my good friend Joe Ellis of Whisky Wednesday turned up on my doorstep, I'd invited him. He didn't just rock up. He bought me a little sample of another Crown Rye, which is this one here. And he has already reviewed this on his Whisky Wednesday YouTube channel. And this is Crown Royal Northern Harvest Rye, which back end of last year, all of a sudden made a big splash across the media around the world. And that was because there is a whisky writer called Jim Murray who looks like this, if you've never come across him before. He's quite divisive in the whisky community, particularly amongst hardcore whisky drinkers. He does an annual book every year called the Whisky Bible, and he samples and rates and scores loads of whiskies through the year. You know, he knows his stuff. If you're going to call somebody a whisky expert, he's up there among certain people just because of the sheer number of whiskies that they've tried, the time that they've spent in the industry, the people that they've met and the things that they've written, all of this lot. You know, he's up there in those echelons of, he knows his stuff. Whether he knows as much as he thinks he knows is another matter of time, and that's why he's so divisive. He's very, very opinionated, very not controversial, but a lot of people disagree with the things that he says, and he has a certain attitude that winds people up the wrong way, and other people go with it. And there is some argument that he not targets, but he is more suited to, or he's more influential to people that don't necessarily know that much about whiskey, and his influence steers those consumers to where he wants them to go rather than what is necessarily the best. So this brings me along to this, because every year he brings out a new Whisky Bible. It's an annual release and it comes out at the end of one year for the next. So the 2016 Whisky Bible was launched, I think it was November of 2015. And in the book he does awards. So he does, best single malt, best single cask single malt, best Irish, all of this lot. And he also does a World Whisky of the Year. And it's one of these things where as soon as you do any kind of awards, you instantly putting a judgment on something, and everybody else is going to either agree or disagree. And the reason that it became so controversial was Crown Royal Northern Harvest Rye was Jim Murray's World Whisky of the Year 2016. So, for 2016. So technically for 2015, this was the best whisky of the year out of all the whiskies that were released. Bit of a bold statement, particularly when you're looking at this. This is what the bottle looks like. You're looking at, I think it's about, what price did I see it for? I saw it for $31. Now I saw I was reading in some of the blurb when it came out was saying this is being sold for $55. But when I checked today on a couple of online resources like liquor stores in California, they were selling it for $31. So unless the price has dropped, which is surprising because you would expect it to go way up after that announcement, you're looking at about 50 quid in the UK if you can find it. So thank you very much, Joe, for this. Now, obviously, this is Jim Murray's personal opinion, and there's been a lot of things written about this in terms of, is this just marketing? Has he been paid to do this? Is this him sticking two fingers up at Scotch whisky? The year before, his World Whisky of the Year was I think it was a Yamazaki. It was a Japanese anyway, and everybody was like, oh my God, it's not Scotch, how can it not be Scotch? Oh, Scotch is falling down, oh, the quality of Scotch, blah, 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 that sort of thing. But it was one of those where it was like, whoa, hang on, Canadian? What are you talking about, Jim? Is this really, there's so many whiskies out there, there are whiskies that are like £200 a bottle, surely they should be better. And it's so subjective, and it narrows everything, and this is part of the problem of awards and why I don't do scores, is because as soon as you put a score or a judgment on something, instantly people are going to compare it to everything else. It's like when people do top 10 games, top 10 films, the top 50 80s films that always seems to be on Channel 4 on a Sunday night, and you're sitting there going, well, why is the Goonies 21 and Pretty Woman's number 7? Well, that can't be right, because it's your personal opinion against the person that's done the list. And yes, they could base it on surveys and everything like that, but it's still, you're always going to have these arguments, because you're always going to have this subjectiveness and objectiveness of, well, I don't think that's right and I think that's wrong. It did seem like a lot of people were going, what the hell is Jim talking about? But a number of other people, more mainstream press, were saying, well, Jim Murray, this is his whiskey Bible. He does this every year. He knows what he's talking about. It must be good because he said it is. So, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I'm only going to put a little bit in, just enough to try, because this isn't part of the challenge. It's just the fact that I had it and I thought it would be very interesting to do. Plus, it'd be interesting to see how it compares to the standard Crown Royal. Crap, you know what I should have done? In fact, I'm going to. I should have put a little bit in just to do a really, really direct comparison. A bit like I did with the Hague Club and Cameron Brie. Better take another sip of water because there was a tiny little drop in there. So, Crown Royal, Northern Harvest Rye, apparently the best whiskey of last year. Now, interestingly, it's even more rye-y than the standard Crown Royal was. But you would expect that, as I probably should have said. Sorry. This is 90% rye and 10% malted rye. Now, what I don't know is what that means. Because technically it's 100% rye, but malted rye, as opposed to malted barley, not quite sure. Whether that's like a green rye, a bit like the sour mash equivalent, so they're taking a bit of the rye mash and adding that into brand new mash. I'm not 100% certain. If you know, stick it in the comments. So, crap, hang on, which one's which? Yeah. But definitely very, like standing in the middle of a field of grain. Really almost metallic, but very, very interesting indeed. So, standard Crown Royal, Northern Harvest. This quite plain in comparison. Almost a melon character coming out of that now. Whereas this is much more. It really is like it's like sniffing an actual ear of rye. It's like being stood in the field of it. Much more interesting. Very juicy as well. Really sort of concentrated, juicy black currants, but black currants off a bramble bush, that sort of thing. instantly more of a hit. There's rye bread in there. There's grains. And it's really quite bready. There's a little bit of bread yeast as well. Sourdough. I mean, this is clearly a rye whiskey. Anything else that you've had that's had rye in it, rye vita, that sort of feel, all those flavours are coming through. It's quite drying. But it's really sort of brown bread and toast and sourdough bread and a little bit earthy as well. There's almost no point me going back to the Standard Crown Royal because that's really going to feel like it's got nothing to it. There's bags of flavour in this. However, it's a little bit dry and a little bit sour for my liking. I'm not a massive fan of sourdough bread, I'll be honest, anyway. And that is quite an element that comes through. And it's because it's got so much rye in it. And personally, it's just not quite soft and sweet enough for me. I would prefer less of an edge. It really does. It's really quite sharp on the sides of your mouth and on your tongue. As sourdough bread is. It really is quite, not rough, but hard. It's a hard whiskey. It's not quite metallic, but it's not far off there. And if you've been following me through my other videos, you'll probably know that I do prefer the softer, richer. Now I like me peated and everything like that, so it's not a case of I only like soft, sweet whiskies. But sometimes you can get those hard, edgy whiskies that are just a little bit too much work, and that's what this is, unfortunately. It's a good whiskey. I wouldn't say it's a standout whiskey. Would I say it's the best whiskey of 2015? No. But then I don't think I'd say what the best whiskey of 2015 is. I could give you a list and I could say these are the 10 best whiskies. In fact, I wouldn't even say these are the 10 best whiskies. These are 10 of the best whiskies I have had in 2015 or 2016. At the end of this challenge, once I've got through 366, I will say these are 10 of the best of the 366 I've had. They're not the 10 best. I've picked 10 out, but there are some that are also equally as good, but I don't want to give you a big whole list of them. That's why in the quarterly reviews, I'm more bothered. I prefer you paid attention to the short list that I've put of my best Scotch and my most interesting, and I picked one out simply because, okay, if you've got to pick one as a sort of award, then do that, but I would encourage you to try all the others because they're all different. So to say that one is the best of that year, nonsense, absolute nonsense, because how can it be? That to me is not any better than any other whiskey that I've had, and it's not as good and not as enjoyable as quite a lot of I've had. So, but it's different, and what doesn't work for me probably works for Jim Murray. Now, there is all this suspicion about the fact that this is a marketing thing and it's owned by Diageo, and Diageo have got lots of money, and oh look, a Diageo brand has suddenly become World Whisky of the Year, and sales of it have absolutely shot up, and Canadian whiskies shot up, and all this lot. Make of that what you will, but in terms of the actual whiskey, it's good. You know, it is a good whiskey. It's interesting, and it's very interesting comparing it to Standard Crown Royal. Given the choice, however, I'd probably go for the Crown Royal Standard Deluxe, simply because it's a lot easier to drink. You feel like you've got to fight the Northern Harvest a little bit. It has got that edgy wryness to it, and to be perfectly honest, personal preference, the Standard Crown Royal doesn't quite have as much to it, but that banoffee pie element and that richness and smoothness I much prefer. But what do I know? I'm not Jim Murray. I'm not a whiskey expert. Interesting, very, very interesting. If you can find Royal Harvest, Northern Harvest, is it worth 50 quid in the UK? I don't think there is. I think there's personally better whiskies, better rye whiskies, actually, to be honest. But it's worth checking it out. But I would also try some other Canadians out as well, because I think you might find that that's not necessarily a true representation of Canadian whiskies in general. Right, I've waffled on too long. I have one more to do for a special occasion. So I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.